History says Custer made his last stand at the Little Bighorn. But what if everything you've been told is wrong? One Lakota warrior, Chief Gall, was there, and his account doesn't just challenge the official story. It completely rewrites it. From chaotic retreats, jammed rifles, and brutal hand-to-hand fighting to who really made the last stand, Gall's forgotten testimony reveals a side of this legendary battle that most Americans have never heard. This is the untold story of Custer's last stand, through the eyes of the man who helped end it. But before we continue, please be sure to like and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next upload. Gall stood over the bodies of his wives and children, and swore he would take revenge on every last soldier. What happened next is nothing like the version you were taught in school. When Lieutenant Colonel George Custer rode into the valley of the Little Bighorn, Chief Gall and his people had only hours to prepare. At 36 years old, Gall was no stranger to war. He had already carved his name in blood and honor, slaying rival warriors and American soldiers alike, earning a fearsome reputation as one of the Hunkpapa Sioux's greatest fighters. So valuable was Gall's courage and wisdom that Chief Sitting Bull himself adopted him as a brother, keeping him close as both an advisor and trusted friend. And when word spread through the camp that Custer was on the march, Gall was among the very first to hear. What he didn't know was that this battle would be unlike any he had faced before. A clash so fierce, so unforgettable, that he would carry it in memory for the rest of his life, retelling the story of Custer's last stand from the native perspective. Chief Gall became one of the first to reveal the truth of that bloody day, reshaping how history remembers the Battle of the Little Bighorn and the fate of George Custer himself. On the morning of June 25, 1876, Sioux scouts stumbled across ration boxes abandoned just miles from the village, evidence that Custer's men were already closing in. American soldiers spotted the Sioux scouts and drove them off, but Custer knew the truth. They would return, and Sitting Bull would be warned. That left him only one option: strike fast before the Sioux could scatter or escape. And just as Custer predicted, the scouts raced back to the village with news of the approaching cavalry. Sitting Bull immediately sent out his own scouts to shadow their movements while he summoned his council of leaders. From the hills, American troops like Sergeant Daniel Knipe reported glimpses of native riders tracking them. Before long, the Sioux scouts returned with critical intelligence. The soldiers had split their forces. What the Sioux didn't yet know was the full scope of Custer's plan. Custer himself had taken 5 companies north, aiming to sweep down on the village from above. To the south, Major Marcus Reno led 3 more companies in a direct assault. And further still, Captain Frederick Benteen was maneuvering with 3 companies to cross the river and close in from the west. The trap was designed to seal off every avenue of escape. Inside the camp, Sitting Bull and the chiefs debated their next move. The safest choice seemed obvious: break camp and withdraw before the soldiers struck. But they had underestimated the speed of the 7th Cavalry. Before the Sioux could even begin their escape, Reno's men came thundering across the river, charging through the timber and straight toward the southern edge of the village. Sitting Bull and I were at the very point where Reno attacked, Gall would later recall. His own Hunkpapa Sioux lodges stood directly in the path of the oncoming cavalry. Gunfire erupted, bullets ripping through the lodges and sending panic through the village. Women and children fled south, desperate to escape Reno's charge, while warriors scrambled to seize their horses. Gall's first thought was not of battle, but of family. He raced through the chaos, searching for his 2 wives and 3 children. But the search ended in heartbreak. Whether by deliberate fire or tragic crossfire, Gall's family had been cut down. His wives and children lay dead among the trampled earth. They were killed there by the pale-faced warriors, Gall would later say. It made my heart bad. Among the Sioux, that phrase carried a meaning deeper than grief. It spoke of despair, fury, and a consuming thirst for vengeance. From that moment forward, Gall was no longer fighting to defend his people. He was fighting for revenge. After that, "I killed all my enemies with the hatchet," he said, a Sioux expression meaning to abandon the gun and take up brutal close-quarters combat. It was the choice of a man who no longer cared if he survived, only that his enemies suffered. Meanwhile, Reno's men had tethered their horses along the timberline and advanced on foot, pouring fire into the camp. Gall quickly joined the warriors, striking back. And though Sitting Bull's name would forever be tied to the battle, he did not fight that day. He remained in camp making medicine, not in the literal sense, but in the spiritual one, creating power that would strengthen the warriors and bring them victory. On the battlefield, leadership fell to men like Gall and the Oglala war chief Crazy Horse. Together, they unleashed a relentless counterattack, volleys of gunfire, followed by waves of mounted charges. Reno's men, just 150 strong, quickly realized they were hopelessly outmatched. Hundreds of Sioux poured in from every direction, their numbers swelling by the minute. Among Reno's soldiers were native scouts from the Crow and Arikara tribes, bitter enemies of the Sioux. The warriors targeted them mercilessly, none more so than Custer's chief scout and longtime ally, Bloody Knife. Bloody Knife's story was complicated. Born half Arikara and half Hunkpapa Sioux, the same people as Gall and Sitting Bull, he had once been Gall's neighbor. But Gall never trusted him, despising his Arikara blood. The tension between them grew so deep that Bloody Knife eventually abandoned the tribe and threw in his lot with the Americans. Now, fate had brought them face to face on opposite sides of the battlefield. Gall and Bloody Knife had long been mortal enemies. Years earlier, Gall had killed several of Bloody Knife's brothers, and even one of his sons. That hatred only deepened when the two men found themselves on opposite sides at Little Bighorn. As Reno's attack unfolded, Bloody Knife rode at his commander's side. Suddenly, a bullet struck him square in the head, splattering blood across Reno himself. Gall carried no rifle that day, so it wasn't his shot, but someone among the Sioux surely recognized Gall's old enemy and finished him for him. The sight shattered Reno's nerve. Already shaken, the grisly death of his trusted scout was the final straw. He ordered a retreat. Panic swept through the ranks. Reno's men scrambled back into the timber to cut their horses loose, then tried to flee across the river. The Sioux warriors swarmed them, Gall among them, dragging men from their saddles to hack them apart or cutting them down with gunfire as they ran. At least 32 Americans fell before the survivors clawed their way to safety on the far side of the river. Gall wanted to press the attack to finish Reno's men on the spot. But the frantic cries of his fellow warriors stopped him cold. Another American force was closing in from the north. If they reached the village, the women and children would be doomed. So Gall turned north with just 3 warriors to confront the new threat, Custer's column. Here, Gall's account diverges from most others. He claimed that he and his small party shadowed Custer's approach from the bluffs east of the river, stopping on a hill 600 yards away to study the soldiers' movements. One officer rode ahead, scanning the ground with binoculars. His hair was shorter than usual, and Gall did not realize until much later that this was Longhair himself, Custer. No one knew, Gall would later insist. We could not tell him from any other. In his telling, Custer hesitated when he saw the vast village spread before him. He paused, waiting for the rest of his men, as if realizing he might have just walked into disaster. And according to Gall, it was then that the Sioux struck first. His warriors charged Custer's men as they crossed the bluffs, 3/4 of a mile from the river. If true, it meant something shocking. Custer's final stand wasn't an attack at all, but a defense. Other warriors remembered it differently. Lazy White Bull, for example, swore that Custer's charge came almost immediately after Reno's defeat. Gall's confusion may have come from the fact that the Cheyenne had already been driving the soldiers back by the time he arrived. Either way, one truth was clear. The battle was about to descend into a storm of blood, chaos, and death. In truth, it's unlikely Gall had scouted Custer before his attack. More likely, when Gall arrived, Custer's men were already in full retreat up the bluffs on the east bank of the river, and Gall mistook their collapse for the beginning of the battle. It was no orderly withdrawal. The trail of American bodies later found on the hillside told the story of a panicked rout. Men dropped every few yards as they tried to escape. The soldiers fought with everything they had, but their Springfield carbines jammed under rapid fire, forcing many to hurl them aside and draw their revolvers instead. Gall remembered soldiers running dry of ammunition mid-fight, only to be cut down by warriors wielding nothing but hatchets. The Sioux turned the battlefield itself into a weapon. With blankets and thunderous cries, they stampeded loose horses straight into the American lines. Riderless mounts tore through the ranks, scattering men and robbing them of their only chance of escape. "It was a slaughter," Gall admitted later. "We took no prisoners. Our hearts were bad, and we cut and shot them all to pieces." Custer's remaining men were driven to the summit of the bluffs, where they split into groups. Companies C, E, and F clung to Custer and his brother Tom, retreating toward the crest of what is now called Custer Hill. Gall never saw the long hair fall. Unlike so many warriors, he never claimed the kill. But he was certain of one thing: Custer's band was not the last to die. Instead, Gall believed the final stand happened just southeast of Custer Hill, where Custer's brother-in-law, Lieutenant James Calhoun, held position with L Company, alongside Captain Miles Keogh's I Company. According to Gall, these men never broke. Step by step, they gave ground, retreating up the slope until they had nowhere left to go. Surrounded, Calhoun's men dismounted and fought on foot, firing until the last cartridge was spent. Keogh tried to link up with Custer across Battle Ridge, but he was shot from his horse and his company overwhelmed. Their bodies were later found piled together, cut down where they stood. Men who refused to run. "They fought strong," Gall said of Custer's men, "but it didn't save them." The Custer fight had ended in less than an hour, but the battle itself was far from over. With Custer gone, Gall wheeled his horse south to finish Reno and perhaps to avenge his family once more. After their chaotic retreat, Reno's men had taken position on a hill to the southeast, waiting desperately for reinforcements. By late afternoon, Captain Benteen and the pack train arrived, swelling their numbers to more than 400. Together, the survivors of 7 companies marched toward Custer's last known position. But by then, Gall confirmed, Custer and his men were already dead. Now it was Reno's turn. Sioux and Cheyenne warriors surged over the bluffs and spotted the Americans advancing. Reno's men, faced with a storm of riders shouting and firing, quickly lost their nerve. They turned back to their hilltop and dug in for survival. The soldiers formed a defensive circle on what is now called Reno Hill. For hours, wave after wave of native warriors probed their defenses. But Gall and Crazy Horse both knew the truth: a night assault would waste lives. Instead, they would harass the soldiers with snipers, keeping them awake while thirst and exhaustion did the killing. "They will fall into our hands when the thirst burns in their throats and drives them mad for water," Gall told his warriors. He was right. By morning, the men on Reno Hill were parched and desperate. Their water was gone, the summer heat unrelenting, and the wounded were dying of thirst. Gall's sharpshooters raked the ravine by the river, cutting down any soldier bold enough to crawl down for water. Only after brutal fighting did the Americans finally open a safe path, a desperate feat that earned several men the Medal of Honor. Then, on the afternoon of June 26th, the end arrived, not for Reno, but for the battle. Sioux scouts spotted dust clouds rising on the horizon. Gall called it the Big Dust. It was the Army, General Alfred Terry and General John Gibbon, marching to rendezvous with Custer. The message was clear. It was time to leave. Sitting Bull's vast village packed quickly, and by sunset the people were on the move, slipping west toward the Bighorn Mountains. It was, by every measure, a stunning victory. The 7th Cavalry had been shattered, Custer dead, and the Sioux and Cheyenne triumphant. But it would not last. In the months that followed, the U.S. Army redoubled its efforts, launching campaign after campaign until the Sioux were forced to surrender. Gall, Sitting Bull, and many others fled north into Canada, clinging to freedom for just a little longer. In the years after the battle, Gall's path took a dramatic turn. Eventually, he and Sitting Bull fell out. Gall gathered his followers, left Canada, and returned to U.S. territory. He settled at the Standing Rock Reservation, converted to Christianity, and even grew close to the very American officials who oversaw the reservation. In 1886, on the 10th anniversary of Little Bighorn, they convinced Gall to attend a commemorative ceremony at the battlefield itself. His presence shocked many, but it was celebrated. And for the first time, Americans heard the story of the battle not from soldiers, but from one of the warriors who had been there. Using a mix of Lakota, English, and sign language, Gall did his best to answer questions and share his memories of that fateful day. But there isn't just one version of Gall's story. Different newspapers recorded different accounts, and the details often shifted. For example, the Chicago Tribune published one telling in June 1886. Just a month later, the St. Paul Pioneer Press printed another, one where Gall placed himself at the north end of the village, claiming he never fought Reno at all, only Custer. Still later, in an 1890 account, Gall claimed to have been in both fights, but left out the death of his family entirely. Was Gall tailoring his story to different audiences? Were reporters mishearing, mistranslating, or perhaps even embellishing his words? Historians have debated that question for nearly 140 years. And yet, no matter which version you believe, one thing remains clear. Gall's testimony marked one of the very first times the American public heard the story of Little Bighorn told from the other side. And while some details may forever remain disputed, Gall's accounts still bring us closer to understanding the full picture of what happened in one of the most legendary battles in American history.